Chapter 13. Left alone, sprawled out atop the high rock in the pine-choked pass, his horse nearby, Ezra studied the back trail with a narrow interest. Throwing a warning shot at the 3-pounding pursuers visible far below, he wondered what had become of his companions. For on first sighting them, he had, as he had told Pat, counted a certain half-dozen and probably no less than 7 or 8. Ezra was himself too good of a strategist to miss the strong likelihood that the remainder of Taggart Flagg's warriors were circling his position with the intent on closing in on him from above. To make matters worse, though the carbine he wielded was equipped to accommodate 45 caliber 6-gun cartridges, once he had exhausted its original load, it would assuredly be no match for rifle fire from the craggy heights above. Made of stern stuff, the lanky redhead stuck firmly to his post while such thoughts as those flitted through his mind. He succeeded in forcing the trio down there off the trail, one of them with a crippled bronc. They took to cover but didn't give up their frontal attack. Slugs screamed off the front of the rock from their position among the ragged pines, and they were working steadily forward. Ezra kept them from any wild chances, consequently slowing their advance. The moments dragged on, but he knew how much time telescoped in such a situation. He would have been given much to know how far along the lazy mare steers were at this point. Hoping of saving them from pursuit by a strong force seemed dubious at best. He had been firing quickly at the agitated brush 100 yards down the trail and was levering a fresh cartridge into the chamber when a sudden jarring smack on the rough rock near his hand changed abruptly to a whining scream. Dust, stinging his gaunt cheek, did not prevent his quick look at that spot. A leaden smear met his eyes where a ball narrowly missed him had ricocheted off. Even as he glanced that way, petrified, Ezra knew the shot could not possibly have come from down that trail. There was only one other possible explanation. Already the enveloping movement by the circling outlaws were closing in on him. He sprang up with a bellow of furious disgust just as a second slug whined off the spot where he had been laying. He leapt to the ground with a jarring plunge and flung himself onto his pony, yanking his head around savagely. The air all about him drowned now with bullets like bees. Somehow he escaped being hit. The astonished horse, under the persuasion of heels ramming into his flanks, burst running down the trail in a wake, heading for the steers. "Well, it's up to Stevens now," grated Ezra, hugging the saddle as his racing mount flashed down over the rocks underfoot. "I give him all the time I could squeeze out, and dang unlikely it didn't do no good." Yelling and a fresh outburst of wild shooting from the rear advertised a close pursuit. So speedily had it come about, the outlaws rendered his position untenable in so complete a style that he had no real hope of Stephen's abilities to whisk the recovered steers out of danger before Taggart's wolves overtook them. Despite a good try, it was simply one of the breaks of a very rough game. Ez no longer bothered to watch behind him, but made the best of his flight with a shrewd eye for the faint possibility of a new ambush. Delaying the outlaws further, if it was even humanly possible, would yet enable him to afford Pat and the others more time with those darn slow-moving cattle. So flinty was the faint trail he followed that little or no sign of passage of stock could even be detected. But the way it seemed plain enough. Ezra stuck to the course he himself would have pursued with the running cattle, expecting every few moments to overhaul the lagging herd. But the laboring horse thrust space behind, and still, the steers they failed to appear ahead. The big fella started to grow uneasy. Already he had covered a mile or more since leaving the pass. Well, hang that, Stevens, he burst out. His steers couldn't have gotten this far without flying. A rifle slug wailed off a lightning-blasted pine stub beside the trail, dissuaded him from pausing long enough to consider his thoughts. He fired backward once and then drilled on down the empty trail. 20 minutes later, pursuit appearing to have been shaken off, and still Ezra had failed to overtake the elusive stock. Conviction assailed him as he sat, hauled up on a lonely pine ridge in deep silence. Well, Stevens must have played her cute, he muttered. He must have pulled off the trail while I told them owl hoots on the pass. He must have holed up somewhere safe as a church, if they ain't been smart enough to smell him out. But there can't be no other answer. Danged if that boy ain't mighty hard to beat. He delayed for an hour, lingering off the trail, watching hawk-like, and at the end of that time, nothing whatsoever had developed. He decided that further action must be in order. So once more he turned back, advancing slowly and quietly through cover a dozen yards away from the trail, lest an outlaw bushwhack attempt awaited. Evening birds sang and whistled in the pines, and by degrees the light started to fade. At last, only the west bore a streak of dying mauve light. Still, he had not succeeded in discovering any sign of life. Turning his back to the trail, Ezra sought water in a comfortable spot, which he found under a rocky overhang, and then taking up a practical notch in his belt, he settled himself down to wait. Only the hoots of fugitive owls and far-off wails of coyotes on the hills disturbed his rest. He awoke and startled in the grey of dawn to an echoing clatter of hooves and a snap on a brush below on the trail. Punctuated by a cheerful lowing of steers and the occasional yip of riders, the sound was self-explanatory. Ezra sprang out of his convert with a grunt of approval. It was a matter of seconds for him to toss on his saddle, cinch up, and a few minutes later he was riding out onto the trail, falling into line behind the lumbering cattle as casually as though he had never been separated from the herd. Ray Morgan was the first to spot his lanky figure through the growing grey light. "Hey!" he called excitedly. "There you are! I was wondering if you'd got snowed under them gunslingers, Ez." The one-eyed man gave him a half-attentive glance and growled, "Any time them stumble bums knock me off, I'll let you know beforehand." And that was all he said. Ray could not help grinning at his gruffness, and Pat jogged up a minute later. "Good work, Ez," he approved. "You give us those extra minutes we needed back there. I didn't have a chance to tip you off on my plans, but we couldn't have tricked Taggart's crowd more neatly. I wouldn't swear we would have done it with them, but it's my guess they've spent the day beating the brush a few miles back. We'll take advantage of that opportunity to shove on." "I figured your game soon as I didn't come up with you on the trail. You must have found a fine spot to hide them beeves. Never noticed where you turned off, not that I was looking hard." Pat's chuckle was quiet. "Oh, we managed all right," was his sole response. They saw nothing further of the outlaws on that day, and nor, although Ezra and Sam rode on ahead to Badger Pass, and did anything occur to delay them at that precarious spot. On the little herd traveled, eating up the miles steadily, and through this largely outlaw territory through which they passed, Pat concluded that sheer audacity would see them safely through to Powder Valley. He was right. On the Ute Gap Range, a crew of 5 men brazenly proposed taking the steers off their hands at a preposterous price, but those men obviously had no connection whatsoever with Mace Galloway's outfit, and Pat succeeded in short order in convincing them that he found no interest in a swindling deal. In the face of too evenly matched fight, The long riders backed down, and they were allowed to pass on unmolested. On the following morning, snow and all blocking their passage on the high trail through the Cumbrellas, it swirled in a gale round about the peaks, and the pine woods rapidly filled with fine, sifting flakes. Somehow they persuaded the weary steers to face the last open slopes. Afternoon saw them dropping down out of the storm into a balmy, sun-drenched weather, one of the startling contrasts for which Colorado was notorious for in the winter. Pat, his partners, cheered. It was clear to the former, however, that young Morgan's uneasiness only increased as he reached the lower levels. So at last he spoke up. "What's bothering you, Red?" he asked. "You got something or other on your mind?" Ray hesitated before replying. "I'd no notion on quitting on you, Stevens, but I can't wait to get over to my place." Pat's grey eyes appraised him with ready understanding. "I understand, boy," he smiled. "You simply got to find out how Candace is doing over there, and in your place I think I'd be feeling just the same way." "Well, what are you waiting for then, Morgan?" Sam struck in, riding close. "Get on your way. We can shove this handful of cows down to Lazy Mary Range easy enough, and we'll be seeing you before long, too." It was his offhand assurance that they did not intend to wash their hands of either the young fellow himself or such troubles as he might find himself possessed of, but Ray, he shot them a grateful glance. "Thanks, boys," he got out with difficulty. "I reckon I owe you a heap already. Maybe I can pay it back some day." "Oh, well, we'll take that wish for the deed," Sam growled. "It ain't for anybody or nowadays that so much bothers to say thanks." Ray didn't wait for more, but he turned his horse away and headed directly towards Star Cross. Inarticulate as Ray was by nature, he felt the strong drag of Ludstone in the prospect of riding back onto the only property he had ever owned. That such a fine girl as Candace awaited him there added its irresistible tug to his heart. He had learned to feel more warmly about her than he was ready to admit it yet. But when he rode into the Star Cross yard half an hour later, Ray's heart sank. No pony stamped in his corral or stood waiting at the kitchen door. There was, in point of a fact, no slightest appearance of anybody having been there for days. Had he really expected much, striving to fight off the leaden disappointment? He bethought himself of China Springs, of course. There, on his hard-bought winter range where his cattle were, if anywhere, he might most reasonably expect to find the girl. But at this hour? Once more it approached a dwindling twilight with night in the offing. Kicking his bronc that way, Ray knew only that he wanted to see Candace again, and at once more than he had ever wanted anything in his life. It was still faintly light when he burst into the lush meadow surrounding the springs, only to haul up in fresh dismay. A few star-crossed steers lingered there at graze, but the bulk of his little herd had drifted off and were gone from sight. Clearly, if anyone had been riding herd on them recently, it hadn't been this day. What inference might be drawn from this, Morgan was at loss to decide. Had Candace given up her care of his precarious interests, perhaps under the pressure of force? It would be like old Zep Cowan to drag the girl off home, spouting wrath and resentment, regardless of what might happen to Ray's unguarded stock. Both Morgan and Candace had reached the age of mature responsibility. Sitting his horse rock-like in the deepened shades of dusk, the young fellow thought he could be pretty sure of what had taken place. With equal certainty, he had no intent of allowing matters to rest at this posture. Well, I'll be barging over to Bullhead now and make my play and be damned, old Cowan, he reflected bleakly. Either he's got to get used to me or we're going to break each other's necks, so what's holding me back? He would have hesitated to put a name of the reason of widely avoiding Dutch Springs on his way to Cowan's ranch, wary as he was of Sheriff Lawler. But at any event, the night effectually concealed him. After striking the Hopewell Junction road, he was soon at the turnoff leading to Candace's home. Lights were burning in the modest ranch house, and stock could be heard moving about the barn and the tangle of pole corrals beyond. Ray hoped the girl's father might be busy at work there and safely out of the way, but scorning either spying or indirection, he rode boldly up to the door. His knock brought a masculine bellow from within, and the door swung back. Light from the kitchen lamp flashed sideways on old Zepp's ruddy face. "Yeah," he called, peering out into the darkness. "Who is it?" The young fella braced himself. "Mr. Cowan, it's Ray Morgan," he spoke up stoutly. "I've come to see Candace, please." "What?" Cowan literally exploded in heady wrath. "Of all the gall, well, Morgan, you can't see my girl, and you won't be seeing her. What more, you'll get off my ranch in a hurry before I get a shotgun to you." He could not have made his position plainer. Ray took a step back, flushing, but held his ground. "If Candace tells me herself that she doesn't want to see me, I'll go. Are you going to give her that chance, Cowan?" "No." Old Zepp hurled the word at him in a freezing denial and rejection. "She don't want nothing to do with you, and I say so, and that's a plenty." "Now look here, Cowan," Ray began in a husky appeal. The scarlet-faced rancher cut him off with a roar. "Myra!" he bawled, beside himself with fury. "Where's my greener shotgun, and you better get her here quick." Morgan had seen Candace's mother hover nervously behind her agitated husband, but there were no evidence of the girl's presence. Tumbling hastily into the saddle, Ray pulled away before matters got altogether out of hand. "Damn him!" he ejected under his breath as he rode away. "Reckon he knows I can't put a slug in his Candace's dad, no matter how I feel." Yet the apparent disappearance of the girl troubled him deeply. "Well, hang it all, I wonder what Stevens will make of this crazy deal." It was a late hour when he rode up to the darkened Lazy Mare ranch house that night, but Trusty Hodge eventually answered his banging summons. "Who is that? Young Morgan?" Pat's voice sounded from somewhere within as the door swung back. "Tell him to come on in, Trusty." Ray found the Lazy Mare owner in bed, the blankets pulled up to his chin. Shading his eyes from the light of the lantern in his palm, Pat listened to the other's story. And that he was displeased was clear from the frown at the end. "Well, there can't be much done tonight," he said at length. "Go put up your horse, Morgan, and crawl into a bunk here. I'll ride into town in the morning and ask about. You might be able to meet Candace there if she knows she can expect you." It was so arranged. After some further discussion, Ray got but a little sleep. However, he tossed restlessly the remainder of that night. Yet he poised himself with such patience as he could muster while Stevens saddled up the following morning and jogged away towards Dutch Springs. He was back at the end of a long 2 hours, shaking his head darkly as he met Ray's anxious look. "She hasn't been seen in town for several days, Red," he announced bluntly. "It looks bad, but whatever the answer must be simple enough. Old Cowan certainly is on the warpath, and Candace can hardly be blamed for laying low." Ray bounced off the porch steps to stride back and forth. He poured out his fears and his threats towards Cowan, releasing his pent-up feelings. Pat waited until he calmed down a wee bit. "Go get your horse, boy," he urged. "We'll go back to the Star Cross if you want and take this business apart. Perhaps you missed something, you know." But when they rode into Morgan's yard at mid-morning, the little ranch lay as empty and anemic as before. Nothing at the barn gave any clue to recent activity there. The dust in the corral was blank, and they were moving about through the musty, shut-in house when gruff voices and a faint thud of hooves outside drew their attention. "Someone's outside," exclaimed Ray with a sudden hope. "Must be either Sam or Ezra." He rushed to the door, and then halted in the opening as abruptly as if suddenly turned to stone. Over his shoulder, Pat was only faintly surprised to glimpse Candace's peppery father, sitting in his saddle, obtuse as a stump, and glowering hotly as at Morgan. "There he is, Lawler," Cowan rumbled into the keen-eyed man at his side. "You might claim he ain't nowhere in the county, but I do not have no particular trouble in stumbling upon him. Better take him in charge before he sneaks off again." Disdaining to avoid the open challenge, Ray stepped out in the yard and shouldered up to the sheriff, who coolly dismounted to meet him. Their eyes met squarely. There was a jangle of metal, and a twinkling Jess had snapped one of the handcuffs upon the young fellow's wrists. "Why, of all the high-handed operations, what's the particular meaning of this business, Lawler?" rasped Ray in tense amazement. "Well, Cowan here accuses you of adopting his girl." The lawman dropped briefly through thin lips. "Maybe you got an alibi, Morgan, but this time you're coming along till it's all straightened out." Ray whirled to direct a blind appeal towards Pat, who was taking it all in without a change of impression. Weighing the matters calmly, Pat took his time, but in the end he shook his head decidingly. "Something's dead wrong here," he said flatly, "but we certainly can't iron it out by flying off the handle. Better just go along with them, Morgan, till I've had my own chance to look around on this." Ray was so stunned by this sudden mischance, dashed a hand blindly across his brows that his tone was muffled. "I can only hope you're not giving me a load of double talk, Stevens. If it had been your intention from the start to bring me back and turn me over to law, you couldn't have arranged it any better." "If you look at it that way." Pat's answer was colorless, betraying by no word or sign the sting that he found in the groundless accusation. "Time alone will prove whether you're right or not, so why should I argue?" Mounting his horse with mechanical awkwardness and avoiding the eyes of those men, Morgan allowed himself to be led off towards jail. End of chapter 13.